The rain in Seattle doesn't just fall, it seeps. It is a persistent gray intrusion that finds the microscopic cracks in the pavement, the hidden gaps in window frames, and eventually, the marrow of your bones. Tonight, as the storm lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of our Medina estate, the damp chill felt less like weather and more like a physical manifestation of the realization that had been rotting in my chest for years. My 15-year marriage was a lie, meticulously constructed and expertly sold. I sat at the kitchen island, my fingers tracing the cold, white veins of the Carrara marble. The kitchen was a masterpiece of modern design, minimalist, expensive, and utterly soulless. It was the kind of room that appeared in architectural digests to prove that wealth could buy silence. Tonight, the silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the rain and the soft, agonizingly domestic sizzle of the oven. I had spent the afternoon preparing a pot roast. It was Vincent's favorite, slow-cooked with rosemary, red wine, and the kind of attention to detail I had applied to every facet of his life for over a decade. The savory, heavy scent filled the room, a cruel irony given that neither of us would ever eat it. I had cooked it out of habit, or perhaps as a final, pathetic tribute to the woman I was supposed to be. The supportive wife, the silent partner, the keeper of the hearth. Vincent walked in at 7:15 p.m. He didn't shake off his umbrella, he left it for the imaginary staff he assumed would always be there to clean up his wake. He looked immaculate in a charcoal gray suit that cost more than my first car, his hair barely disturbed by the gale outside. He didn't kiss me. He didn't even look at me. He simply placed a thick, manila envelope on the marble island and slid it toward me with the tip of his index finger. "Eat first?" I asked, my voice sounding thin and brittle, like old parchment. "I'm not hungry, Alexis," he said. He remained standing, leaning one hand on the counter, looking out at the black expanse of Lake Washington. "And frankly, we don't have time for the domestic charade anymore. It's over. I've had Harold draft the preliminary papers." He spoke with the clinical detachment of a surgeon explaining a necessary, if minor, procedure. There was no heat in his voice, no lingering resentment, and, most devastatingly, no grief. To Vincent Mercer, I was no longer a person. I was a line item that needed to be reconciled. I reached out, my hand trembling, a performance that required very little effort, and pulled the documents toward me. The bold headers leaped off the page. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Settlement agreement. Asset distribution. "I've been fair," Vincent continued, finally turning to face me. His eyes were the color of the Seattle sky, hard, cold, and impenetrable. "But I need to be clear about the terms. I want the firm. I want this house. I want the lake property in Chelan. I've built the Mercer name into a brand, Alexis. I can't have it dismantled by a messy litigation." "The firm," I whispered. "Vincent, I spent 11 years managing those books. I coordinated every contractor for the East Side development. I was the one who—" "You were the wife," he interrupted, his voice sharpening just enough to draw blood. "You were compensated with a lifestyle most women would kill for. But let's be honest, you haven't been ambitious in years. You've stayed stagnant while I moved forward. It's time for a clean break." He leaned in closer, his shadow stretching across the white marble like a stain. "In exchange for a quiet exit, I'm letting you keep Tyler. Full physical custody. I'll provide a modest monthly allowance for his care, of course, but I think it's best if he stays with you. He's always been more your speed." The way he said, "letting you keep," made my stomach turn. He spoke of our 15-year-old son as if he were a piece of aging office equipment, a liability he was graciously offloading to avoid the maintenance costs. He didn't see the boy's talent, his sensitivity, or his brilliance. He only saw a tether to a past he was desperate to outrun. I looked down at the papers, the ink blurring as the familiar sting of tears gathered in my eyes. I let a single drop fall onto the legal bond paper, watching the fiber soak it up. I wanted him to see the breakage. I wanted him to believe the kill was complete. But beneath the layer of performed sorrow, deep in the coldest, most private part of my soul, a hard ember began to glow. It was a secret I had guarded for 3 agonizing years. I knew about the 3 mortgages. I knew about the $250,000 he was underwater on this very house. I knew that the Mercer brand was a house of cards currently being licked by the flames of nearly $2 million in hidden debt. Vincent thought he was taking the gold and leaving me the dust. He had no idea he was demanding the anchor while I was swimming away with a life jacket. "Is this what 15 years is worth, Vincent?" I asked, my voice a jagged sob. "A few bags of clothes and a modest allowance?" "I gave you my youth. I gave you my career." He didn't flinch. He didn't offer a hand to comfort me. Instead, he simply twisted his wrist to check his Patek Philippe. The polished gold reflected the kitchen lights, a blinding spark of arrogance. 15 years is a long time, Alexis. People change. Contracts expire. He straightened his tie in the reflection of the oven door. "Harold will call your person tomorrow. I suggest you sign. If you fight me, I'll make sure the modest allowance becomes non-existent. I have the resources, and well, you have a guest room to pack." He turned on his heel, his leather soles clicking sharply against the hardwood as he headed toward the stairs. He was already thinking about his new chapter. He was probably already texting Brittany, telling her the problem had been handled. I stayed slumped over the marble island for a long time, the smell of the ruined pot roast filling my lungs. To any observer, I was a woman destroyed, a wife discarded in the most brutal fashion imaginable. But as the sound of his footsteps faded, I sat up straight. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't call a friend to cry. I didn't call my sister to vent. I sent a single, encrypted message to Nina Castellano. He took the bait. He wants the assets. All of them. The rain continued to lash against the glass, but I no longer felt the chill. The execution was over, but Vincent Mercer had no idea that he was the one lying on the floor. I looked at the manila envelope, the instrument of my supposed demise, and for the first time in 3 years, I allowed myself a very small, very cold smile. The game was no longer a secret. It was a countdown. The humiliation wasn't an accident, it was curated. It was a gallery exhibition of my failures, staged in the very home I had spent 15 years perfecting. Within 48 hours of the execution, the vultures began to circle, their wings beating against the glass walls of my grief. They didn't come to offer comfort, they came to survey the wreckage and see what parts were still worth scavenging. The first to arrive was Diane Holloway. We had been friends since high school, 20 years of shared secrets, birthdays, and the kind of intimacy that is supposed to be unbreakable. She showed up at my door with a bottle of expensive Chardonnay and a face that wore a mask of practiced tragedy. "Oh, Alexis," she cooed, pulling me into a hug that felt like the coil of a snake. "I came as soon as I heard. I couldn't believe it. Not Vincent. Not after everything." We sat in the sunroom, the afternoon light glinting off the lake. Diane poured the wine with a steady hand, her eyes darting around the room. I watched her through lowered lashes, playing the part of the woman too broken to notice the predatory gleam in her gaze. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking at the custom Italian velvet sofa. She was measuring the windows for new drapes. She was already mentally moving in. "He's just confused, honey," she whispered, patting my hand. Her touch made my skin crawl. Men go through these phases. They hit a certain age and they panic. They think they need something new to feel alive. While her mouth was full of platitudes, her right hand was tucked beneath the edge of the glass table, her thumb flying across her phone screen. I knew what she was doing. She was reporting back. "She's a mess, Vincent. She's barely eating. She has no fight left." I let a sob escape my throat, a jagged, pathetic sound. "I just don't understand, Diane. I gave him everything. How can he just replace me?" "You didn't do anything wrong," she said, though the slight smirk at the corner of her lips suggested otherwise. "But you know Vincent. He's a shark. He needs constant momentum. Maybe you two just Lost your rhythm. She stayed for 3 hours, drinking most of the wine and fishing for information. Are you hiring a lawyer? Are you going to contest the prenup? Where are you planning to go? Every question was a probe, a way to map out my defenses for the man she hoped to marry next. She had been carrying a torch for Vincent since our wedding day, a silent, flickering envy that had finally found its fuel. She thought she was being subtle. She didn't realize that when you spend years managing a real estate empire's books, you learn to read the fine print in people's souls. Diane was the spy, but the general arrived the following morning. Lorraine Mercer didn't knock. She used her spare key and marched into the foyer with the authority of a conquering monarch. My mother-in-law, the matriarch of Mercer Real Estate, was a woman who viewed emotions as a structural weakness. She was dressed in a pristine Chanel suit, her pearls reflecting the morning light like tiny, cold orbs of judgment. Behind her stood 2 men from the firm's maintenance crew. They weren't carrying moving boxes. They were carrying rolls of heavy-duty black garbage bags. "Alexis," Lorraine said, her voice like the snap of a winter branch. She didn't look at me. She walked over to a Ming vase on the console table and flicked a microscopic speck of lint off its surface. "I see you're still here. I had hoped you'd have the dignity to make this transition swift." "Lorraine, it's only been 3 days," I said, my voice trembling with a carefully calibrated weakness. "I haven't even told my parents yet. I don't have a place to go." She finally turned to me, her eyes narrowing. "Then you should have planned better. A woman who stops being an asset quickly becomes a liability. Vincent is moving forward with his life. This house is a part of his public image, and frankly, you no longer fit the aesthetic." She gestured to the maintenance men. "Start in the master suite. Anything that isn't a marital asset goes in the bags. The rest stays." "The bags?" I gasped, moving toward her. "Lorraine, those are my clothes. My grandmother's things. You can't just throw them in trash bags." "They are suitable for the destination, I'm sure," she sighed, checking her gold watch. "Men have appetites, dear. It's a biological fact. You became stagnant. You stopped trying to keep up with his light, and now you're surprised that you're sitting in the dark. It's time to stop being dramatic and start being practical." For the next 4 hours, I watched as the history of my life was stuffed into plastic. My silk dresses, my favorite shoes, the hand-knitted blankets I'd used to tuck Tyler in when he was a toddler, all of it was treated like refuse. Lorraine personally supervised the culling. She hesitated at my jewelry box, her fingers lingering on a diamond tennis bracelet Vincent had given me for our 10th anniversary. "Marital asset," she murmured, snapping the box shut and handing it to one of the men. "Technically purchased with firm dividends. It stays." I sank onto a kitchen chair, burying my face in my hands. I let my shoulders shake. I let them hear the quiet, desperate sounds of a woman losing her world. I wanted them to feel the absolute intoxication of their own power. I wanted Lorraine to feel the thrill of erasing me, and I wanted Diane, who had coincidentally texted to ask if I needed help packing, to report every humiliated tear back to Vincent. They saw a woman drowning. They saw a wife who had been so thoroughly broken that she couldn't even stand up to her mother-in-law. What they didn't see was the mental ledger I was keeping. Every garbage bag they filled was one less thing I would have to deal with when the banks moved in. Every piece of furniture Lorraine reclaimed for Vincent was another item added to the list of assets he was legally bound to protect, and another dollar of debt he was assuming. "I'm sorry I wasn't enough, Lorraine," I whispered, looking up with reddened eyes as she prepared to leave. She paused at the door, her expression softening just enough to be terrifying. "It's not about being enough, Alexis. It's about being relevant. You simply expired." She left then, the scent of her expensive perfume lingering like a toxic cloud. I sat in the middle of my foyer, surrounded by black plastic bags, the house echoing with a hollow, haunted silence. I waited until I heard her car pull out of the driveway. Then, I stood up. I wiped my eyes with a dry, steady hand. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, not wine, and dialed Nina Castellano. "Nina," I said, my voice no longer trembling. It was cold. It was precise. It was the voice of the woman who had managed the Mercer books for 11 years without making a single mistake. "They've started the culling. Vincent is officially in possession of the Medina assets. The liability transfer is complete. Tell the bank's investigators that the primary debtor is now the sole resident." I looked out at the lake. The water was choppy, the storm from the night before still rippling across the surface. They thought they had pushed me into the deep end. They had no idea I was the one who had choreographed the tide. The arrival of Brittany Sawyer wasn't a sudden storm. It was a slow, agonizing sunrise over a landscape I no longer recognized. She didn't knock, and she didn't wait for an invitation. She simply appeared, a shimmering apparition of youth and unearned confidence, standing in my kitchen as if she were the one who had spent a decade selecting every tile, every handle, and every hinge. I had been in the guest room, staring at the black garbage bags Lorraine had left behind, when I heard the high-pitched hum of the Vitamix. It was a mundane sound, yet in the context of my shattered life, it sounded like a chainsaw cutting through the last of my dignity. I walked into the kitchen, my footsteps heavy, and stopped dead. Brittany was 27, a junior architect at Vincent's firm, a girl whose biggest professional achievement to date was likely a well-rendered bathroom floor plan. She was wearing a pair of yoga pants that cost more than my weekly groceries and a silk camisole that whispered of effortless wealth. But it was what she wore over them that made my breath hitch in my throat. She was wearing my grandmother's vintage apron. The pale yellow linen, hand-embroidered with tiny blue forget-me-nots, was cinched tight around her slender waist. My grandmother, the woman who taught me that a lady always keeps her own money and her own secrets, had worn that apron while teaching me how to make the very pot roast Vincent had rejected 3 nights ago. "Oh, hi," Brittany chirped. She didn't look up from the blender as she dropped in a handful of organic kale and a splash of almond milk. Her blonde highlights shimmered under the recessed lighting I had stayed up until 2 a.m. designing to ensure there were no shadows on the prep surfaces. "You must be Alexis." "I'm Brittany. Vincent said you were still wrapping things up." She turned off the blender, the sudden silence more jarring than the noise. She poured the thick, green sludge into a crystal glass, one of the Waterford flutes we'd received as a wedding present, and took a delicate sip. "Vincent said you wouldn't mind if I started measuring for the new nursery," she said, her voice a saccharine melody of feigned innocence. "We want to get the renovations started as soon as the final papers are signed. This sage green in the kitchen is a bit dated, don't you think?" I was thinking a sophisticated charcoal or a builder-grade gray. Something more now. The cruelty was effortless. It wasn't the jagged, intentional malice of Lorraine. It was the casual, unthinking entitlement of a girl who had never been told no. To Brittany, I wasn't a woman whose life she was dismantling. I was merely an obstacle to be moved, an old tenant whose lease had expired. "The nursery?" I managed to whisper, my voice cracking perfectly. I leaned against the marble island, the cold stone biting into my palms. You're pregnant?" She giggled, a sound like glass beads falling on silk. "Oh goodness, no. Not yet. But Vincent is so excited to start over. He says he finally feels like he has the right partner to build a real legacy with. Someone with vision." I felt the familiar sting of tears, but beneath them, the ember of my secret flared white-hot. Vision. Vincent wanted a legacy, yet he was handing the keys to his kingdom to a woman who thought charcoal paint could hide a crumbling foundation. "I see," I said, dabbing at my eyes with the back of my hand. I let my gaze wander to the doorway, where Vincent now stood. He looked refreshed, his charcoal suit swapped for a casual cashmere sweater. He didn't look like a man whose world was about to end. He looked like a man who had just traded in a reliable sedan for a temperamental sports car and was enjoying the new car smell. He walked over to Brittany and placed his hand on her waist, pulling her flush against him. It was a gesture of possession so blatant it felt like a slap. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and boredom. "Alexis, I didn't think you'd be down here." Brittany wants to get a head start. The contractors are coming on Monday. Monday? I asked, my voice trembling. Vincent, I haven't even found an apartment yet. Tyler hasn't packed his books. Then you should hurry, he said, his tone flat. He checked his watch, the Patek Philippe again, a golden shackle of his own making. We have a dinner reservation at La Maison at 8 o'clock. I'd appreciate it if you were back in the guest room by then. It's awkward for Brittany to see you like this. Awkward, I repeated, a single tear escaping and rolling down my cheek. 15 years. Vincent, I helped you build every bit of this. I was your bookkeeper, your manager, your everything when you had nothing. And you were compensated, he snapped, the boredom flashing into a brief, sharp anger. But the firm has grown beyond your capabilities, Alexis. You're looking backward. Brittany and I are looking forward. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have a life to plan. He kissed the top of Brittany's head, a choreographed display of affection designed to wound. She smiled up at him, her eyes bright with the reflected light of a house she didn't realize was already burning. I stood there for a moment, the picture of the discarded wife. I looked at my grandmother's apron on Brittany's waist, and for a second, I almost reached out to rip it off her. But I stopped. I forced myself to stay still. I hope you'll be very happy here, Brittany, I said, my voice barely audible. I hope the gray paint makes you feel right at home. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, my head bowed. As I climbed the stairs to the guest room, the room that used to be my craft space, the room where I had quietly documented 3 years of Vincent's financial suicide, I heard them laughing. I reached the top of the stairs and went into the room, closing the door softly. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat down at the small desk and opened my laptop. I looked at the latest bank statements I had pulled that morning. The third mortgage was officially in default. The lines of credit for Mercer Real Estate were being frozen one by one. Vincent had spent the morning authorizing a $20,000 deposit for nursery renovations, using a business account that was already $15,000 over its limit. He was decorating a sinking ship with gold leaf. I sent a quick email to my uncle, the retired accountant. He's bringing her in. He's spending money he doesn't have on a house the bank already owns. The ego is fully engaged. He won't look at the fine print now. I looked at the photo of Tyler on the desk, my smart, observant son who was currently at soccer practice, unaware that his world had been stuffed into garbage bags. My heart ached for him, but I knew that this was the only way. To save his future, I had to let his father destroy the present. Downstairs, I heard the front door close. They were leaving for dinner. They were going to La Maison, our place, where Vincent would likely order the same vintage Bordeaux he always did, charging it to a corporate card that would decline by the end of the month. I stood up and walked to the window, watching his silver Porsche pull out of the driveway. Brittany was in the passenger seat, her blonde hair whipping in the wind, wearing my husband's attention like a new piece of jewelry. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, silver key to my separate safety deposit box. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head, clear and steady. Never let them see you coming, Alexis. Let them think they've won. That's when they stop looking at the map. I looked at the kitchen light shining below. Brittany had left it on. I didn't go down to turn it off. Let it burn. It wasn't my electricity bill anymore. The transition from the sprawling glass-walled luxury of Medina to a cramped, two-bedroom walk-up in a salt-stained corner of Ballard felt like a sudden, violent decompression. In Medina, the air smelled of expensive cedar and Lake Washington's mist. Here, it smelled of old rain, fried fish from the nearby docks, and the lingering dampness of a building that had seen too many Seattle winters. Our new living room was a labyrinth of cardboard. The black garbage bags Lorraine had packed sat slumped against the peeling baseboards like body bags for a life that had been unceremoniously murdered. There was no recessed lighting here, only a flickering fluorescent tube in the kitchen that hummed with a depressing, low-frequency buzz. Tyler sat on a stack of boxes that contained his high school yearbooks and his soccer trophies. At 15, he was already nearly as tall as his father, but in the dim light of the apartment, he looked small, his shoulders hunched in a defensive posture he'd adopted the moment we crossed the threshold. The silence between us was heavy, vibrating with the unspoken accusations of a son who felt his mother had simply handed over the keys to his kingdom without a whimper. "Mom?" His voice cracked, cutting through the hum of the refrigerator. I stopped unpacking a box of mismatched kitchenware, the scraps Vincent had deemed beneath his new aesthetic.
"Yes, Ty? Why didn't you fight?"
He looked up, his eyes glassy with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning resentment. "Dad he's parading that girl around our house. Grandma Lorraine treated you like trash.
And you just let them take everything. The house, the money, the cars.
We're living in a shoebox, and he's probably at the club right now." This was the hardest part of the long game. It was the only part one hadn't fully braced for. The necessity of becoming a villain, or at least a coward, in the eyes of the person I loved most.
I had to let him believe I was weak.
I had to let him feel the sting of this poverty, so that his father would never suspect the trap I had set. If Tyler knew we were safe, his behavior would change. He wouldn't look at Vincent with that heartbreaking disappointment that made Vincent feel so superior, so winning. I walked over and sat on a smaller box labeled linens, reaching out to touch his knee. He flinched, just a fraction. "Sometimes, Tyler, fighting doesn't look like shouting," I said, my voice soft, carrying the weight of a simulated defeat. "Sometimes you have to let go of what's heavy so you don't sink with it. Your father, he wanted the business and the house more than he wanted us.
I couldn't force him to stay. But the money, Mom."
"You worked there for years," he erupted, standing up and pacing the 5 steps it took to cross the room.
"You're a legal assistant. You know the law. Why are we here?"
"I'm doing the best I can, honey," I whispered. I hated the sound of my own voice, thin, frail, the voice of a victim.
"We have each other. That has to be enough for now."
He stared at me for a long beat, shook his head in disgust, and disappeared into his bedroom, slamming the door. The sound echoed through the thin walls, a sharp punctuation to my supposed failure. I stayed on the box for a long time, listening to the muffled sounds of the Ballard traffic. Then, once I was sure he was asleep, I retreated to my own room. I locked the door, pulled my laptop from a hidden sleeve in my suitcase, and plugged in an encrypted black drive. The blue light of the screen illuminated the small room, casting long, jagged shadows. I opened the folder titled The Mercer Ledger. Vincent thought he had taken the crown jewels. He thought he had outmaneuvered the stagnant wife who didn't understand the high-stakes world of real estate. He was so blinded by the glare of his own ego that he couldn't smell the smoke rising from his own accounts. I scrolled through the documents I'd been quietly harvesting for 3 years. 3 mortgages on the Medina estate. The first was the original $400,000. The second, taken out 4 years ago to fund a luxury development in Bellevue that had stalled in permitting, was $350,000. The third, the one that really signaled the end, was a $350,000 high-interest bridge loan he'd taken 2 years ago to cover the margins on a disastrous cryptocurrency play. Total debt on the house, $1.1 million. Current market value in a cooling Seattle market, maybe $850,000. He was underwater by $250,000 on his primary residence alone. I clicked over to the business spreadsheets. Mercer Real Estate was a hollowed-out shell. He had maxed out every line of credit, totaling $200,000. He owed $85,000 in back taxes he'd deferred to pay for his Porsche lease and Britney's jewelry. Vendor debts to contractors, men who had families and didn't take kindly to being stiffed, totaled another $120,000. Vincent Mercer owed roughly $1.9 million to the world. His total actual asset value, if liquidated today, was barely $1.6 million.
He hadn't taken my life.
He had taken a house of paper that was already catching fire. By insisting on sole ownership of the assets, and by signing the liability addendum my lawyer Nina had so brilliantly buried in the settlement, Vincent had legally shielded me from the fallout. He had demanded the captain's hat while the Titanic was already vertical in the water. I navigated to a different tab, one that Vincent didn't even know existed.
The trust.
There it was, sitting in a quiet, offshore-managed irrevocable trust. $520,000. It was composed of the $340,000 my grandmother had left me. Money I had never touched, never commingled, and never mentioned. The rest was $180,000 from my own IRA and savings from my years at the law firm before Vincent convinced me to work for him for the family's future. That money was Tyler's college. It was his first home. It was our actual life. And because I had moved it into a trust for my son before the divorce was even filed, and because it was sourced from separate property, Vincent's creditors couldn't touch a cent of it. In his eyes, I was a woman with $50,000 in cash and a used Volvo. In reality, I was the only person in the Mercer family who was actually solvent. I closed the laptop and leaned my head against the cold window pane. Across the street, a neon sign for a dive bar flickered on and off. The Golden Girl Brittany was probably at this very moment choosing $40 a yard wallpaper for a nursery in a house the bank would seize within months. Vincent was probably toasted by his golf buddies, celebrating his clean break from the wife who had no ambition. I thought of Tyler's face, the disappointment, the hurt. It felt like a knife in my chest, but I had to keep the blade there. If I told him now, he might let it slip. He might look at his father with pity instead of anger, and Vincent's survival instinct might actually kick in.
No.
For the trap to work, Vincent had to believe he was a god.
He had to believe I was nothing.
I climbed into my small, unfamiliar bed, the smell of Ballard's salt air filling the room. Tomorrow I would wake up, put on my worn sweater, and continue to look like a woman who had lost everything. I would be the architect of my own humiliation until the very second the fire reached the roof. The house of paper was burning. I just had to make sure I didn't try to put it out. The mediation suite was located on the 42nd floor of a glass skyscraper in downtown Seattle, overlooking a harbor choked with fog. The room was sterile, smelling of industrial lemon cleaner and the high-priced desperation of couples tearing their lives apart. Large mahogany tables separated the combatants, and the air conditioning hummed with a low, predatory vibration. I arrived exactly 4 minutes late.
It was a calculated move.
A woman in control arrives early. A woman drowning in her own grief loses track of time. I wore a sweater that was a size too large, a muted heather gray that washed out my complexion, and I had skipped my usual morning makeup, leaving the faint dark circles under my eyes exposed for everyone to see. Beside me sat Nina Castellano. She was the polar opposite of my curated frailty. Nina was 52, dressed in a sharp, obsidian black power suit, her hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful. She sat with a posture that suggested she had spent the morning chewing glass and was now looking for something to wash it down with. She was the shark my sister had begged me to hire, but today, she was playing her part in my script, the frustrated professional burdened by a weak, sentimental client. Across from us sat Vincent and his lead counsel, Harold Whitfield. Harold was the kind of lawyer who wore a pocket square and smiled like a crocodile. Vincent, however, looked like he was attending a coronation. He sat back in his leather chair, his $15,000 Patek Philippe catching the fluorescent light, his eyes moving over me with a mixture of boredom and a flickering, satisfied pity. "Shall we begin?" the mediator asked, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Henderson who looked at me with a kind of heartbreaking sympathy usually reserved for three-legged dogs. "My client has reviewed the proposed asset distribution," Harold started, his voice a smooth baritone. "Mr. Mercer is prepared to be exceptionally generous. He is taking on the full burden of the real estate holdings, the complexities of the firm, and the maintenance of the primary residence in Medina. He recognizes that Mrs. Dunst may not have the professional capacity to manage such heavy assets in her current state." "Generous," Nina snapped, slamming a folder onto the table. "You're stripping her of 15 years of equity. You're taking the lake house, the firm, everything they built together. My client is entitled to 50% of the Mercer brand." I reached out and touched Nina's arm, my fingers trembling. "Nina, please," I whispered, my voice sounding like it was being squeezed through a narrow throat. "I can't do this."
I don't want to fight anymore. Alexis, don't be foolish, Nina hissed, loud enough for Vincent to hear. We can take him for millions.
I shook my head, a single practiced tear rolling down my cheek. I turned to face Vincent, who was watching the exchange with a smug, predatory light in his eyes.
He loved this. He loved seeing me broken.
He loved that even my own lawyer thought I was a coward. I just want it to be over, Vincent, I said, dabbing my eyes with a crumpled tissue.
I just want enough to start over. For Tyler. I don't need the houses. I don't need the stress of the firm. It's too much.
Vincent leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. What is it you're asking for, Alexis?
Specifically. I took a shaky breath.
I want $50,000 in cash. I want the 2021 Volvo. And I want shared custody of Tyler, with him primarily living with me in Ballard.
That's it. You keep the rest.
The Medina house, the Chelan property, the office building, the firm.
All of it. The room went silent.
Harold Whitfield actually blinked, his crocodile smile faltering for a split second before returning 10 times wider. He looked at Vincent, who was trying to suppress a laugh. They had prepared for a bloodbath, and I was handing them a white flag made of silk. Alexis, as your attorney, I strongly advise against this, Nina growled, her face turning a vivid shade of red.
You are leaving millions on the table. It's my life, Nina.
I cried out, my voice cracking.
I just want peace.
Harold cleared his throat, sensing the opportunity to close the deal before the weak wife regained her senses. We find those terms acceptable. In fact, in the spirit of finality, we have the settlement agreement ready for preliminary signature. It includes the full transfer of all marital real estate and business interests to Mr. Mercer. Harold slid a thick, 300-page document across the mahogany table. It was the monster, the legal behemoth that codified our divorce. Vincent picked up an expensive fountain pen. He began signing the initial pages with a flourish, his arrogance radiating off him like a physical heat. He didn't even read the pages, he just watched me, his eyes telling me how much he enjoyed his total victory. He was so eager to win, so desperate to legally detach himself from the stagnant wife, that he didn't even glance at the addendum C, liability and encumbrance indemnification buried on page 214. That specific clause, drafted by Nina with surgical precision, stated that by accepting sole ownership of the aforementioned assets, the recipient, Vincent Mercer, voluntarily assumed full and exclusive responsibility for any and all mortgages, liens, business debts, tax liabilities, and outstanding encumbrances associated with said assets. It explicitly held me, Alexis Dunst, harmless and legally separate from the financial ruin that was currently devouring those properties from the inside out. Vincent reached the final signature page. He looked at me one last time, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. You always were a bit too soft for this world, Alexis, he said, scribbling his name in bold, aggressive strokes.
I took the pen from him. My hand shook as I signed my name below his.
To Vincent, this was the moment I became a nobody. To me, this was the moment I stepped off a sinking ship and watched the captain lock himself in the hold. Done, the mediator said, stamping the documents. We'll file these with the court immediately. Vincent stood up, adjusted his suit jacket, and didn't even say goodbye. He walked out of the room with Harold, their laughter echoing in the hallway as they headed toward the elevators. They were probably going to celebrate at a high-end bar, oblivious to the fact that they had just fought a war to win a mountain of debt. The door clicked shut. Nina Castellano leaned back in her chair. The redness in her face vanished instantly. Her posture straightened, and the frustrated look in her eyes was replaced by a cold, sharp brilliance. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sleek, silver thermos, pouring herself a cup of coffee. That, Nina said, her voice steady and calm, was an Oscar-worthy performance, Alexis.
I almost felt sorry for you myself.
I sat up straight, the trembling in my hands vanishing as if by magic. I wiped the dry tear from my cheek and let out a long, slow breath. The gray sweater still felt heavy, but the weight in my chest was gone.
Is the liability addendum airtight? I asked.
It's more than airtight, Nina smiled, a slow, dangerous expression.
It's a vacuum.
He just signed a legal confession that every penny of that $1.9 million debt is his and his alone. He took the houses, the firm, and the cars, but he also took the foreclosure notices, the tax liens, and the lawsuits from the contractors.
I looked out the window at the Seattle fog.
Below us, somewhere in the city, Vincent was feeling like a king. He didn't know that the bank's automated systems were already flagging his accounts. He didn't know that the third mortgage on the Medina house had triggered a due on sale clause because of the title transfer.
How long do we have? I asked.
The first default notices should hit his desk within 48 hours, Nina said, packing her things. By the time he realizes he's drowning, you'll be sitting in Ballard with $50,000 in clean cash and a $500,000 trust for your son that he can't touch.
I stood up, feeling a strange sense of lightness.
I had been the wife for 15 years, the bookkeeper for 11, and the victim for 3 months. But as I walked out of that mediation suite, I was finally the only thing that mattered.
I was the survivor. Would you like to go for lunch?
Nina asked as we reached the elevators.
No, I said, thinking of Tyler sitting on his boxes in our small apartment. I need to go home. I have a son who thinks his mother is a coward. I think it's time I started showing him who I really am.
The Ballard apartment, once a symbol of my supposed defeat, was slowly becoming a sanctuary. The salt air from the sound seemed to scrub away the lingering scent of Vincent's expensive cologne and Lorraine's stifling perfume. We had settled into a rhythm of forced simplicity, mismatched plates, a humming refrigerator, and a silence that was no longer heavy with grief, but thick with anticipation. While I maintained my role as the struggling divorcee, working long hours at a small boutique law firm near the locks, the world I had left behind in Medina was beginning to fracture. I didn't need to spy. The debris was washing up on my shores through Tyler. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Tyler spent the evening at the palace, as he'd taken to calling the Medina estate with a new, sharp-edged sarcasm. At first, he would return angry, slamming doors and mourning the loss of his high-status life. But lately, the anger had been replaced by a quiet, observant confusion. "He's different, Mom," Tyler said one Tuesday night, dropping his backpack by the door. He didn't head straight for his room this time. He sat at our small, scratched wooden kitchen table, watching me stir a pot of simple pasta.
"Different how, Ty?"
I kept my back to him, keeping my voice neutral.
"He's snapping. All the time.
Especially at Brittany," Tyler said, leaning his chin on his hand. "She was crying in the pantry today because she ordered some custom wallpaper for the nursery, and Dad went ballistic.
He shouted that she was bleeding him dry."
He's never shouted about money before.
"Not like that."
I turned around, leaning against the counter. Maybe he's just stressed with the new firm transition.
"It's more than that," Tyler said, his brow furrowing.
"He's not wearing the Patek anymore."
"The gold one?"
He said it was in for servicing, but he's wearing this cheap, plastic digital watch that looks like something a gym teacher would wear. And the Porsche, he hasn't driven it in a week. He told me the fuel pump was out, but I saw a guy in a plain truck idling at the end of the driveway this morning, taking pictures of the VIN number. I felt a surge of adrenaline, but I suppressed it. The repo men were circling. The fuel pump wasn't broken, the lease payments were.
"And the Instagram posts?"
Tyler continued, pulling out his phone. He used to post every morning, #morninggrind, #MercerLegacy, #newchapter. He hasn't posted in 10 days. The last one was a picture of a sunset with some quote about strength in adversity. The comments are full of people asking when they're going to get paid for the East Side drywall job. I walked over to the table and sat opposite him. The fluorescent light hummed above us, but for the first time, it didn't feel depressing. It felt like a spotlight on the truth. "The vendors are calling the house too," Tyler added, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I answered the landline yesterday. Some guy named Marco was screaming about a 60-day overdue invoice for the office landscaping. He said if he didn't get a check by Friday, he was going to show up at the firm with a megaphone.
What did your father do?
He took the phone and hung it up. Then he ripped the cord out of the wall.
He looked old, Mom.
His skin was gray, and his hands were shaking so hard he couldn't light his cigar. Tyler looked around our cramped kitchen, the peeling linoleum, the second-hand toaster, the stacks of boxes we still hadn't fully unpacked. Then he looked back at me, his eyes searching mine with a sudden piercing intelligence. "Dad's pretending, isn't he?" he asked, his voice no longer cracking with adolescent insecurity.
It was steady. He's not actually rich. He didn't win the divorce.
He just took all the stuff that was already broken.
I reached across the table. I didn't offer a platitude. I didn't pretend to be the broken woman.
I reached out and squeezed his hand, my grip firm and sure. For the first time in months, I allowed a real smile, a sharp, knowing smile, to touch my lips. "The truth is a patient hunter, Tyler," I said. "It doesn't need to bark to let you know it's coming. It just waits for the light to change."
Tyler stared at me, his mouth slightly open.
He saw the shift in my posture, the clarity in my eyes. He saw that the woman sitting across from him wasn't a victim of his father's ambition. She was the architect of his father's reality.
"You knew," he breathed, a slow grin spreading across his face. "You knew the house was underwater. You knew the firm was failing.
That's why you didn't fight him for the Medina house.
You let him have the debt."
"I let him have exactly what he valued most, Tyler, the appearance of success. The problem with appearances is that they require constant maintenance. And maintenance costs money that your father no longer has." The distance that had grown between us over the last few months, the resentment, the shame, the feeling that I had abandoned our dignity, evaporated in that single moment of shared truth. My son didn't see a weak mother anymore. He saw a strategist. "So what happens now?" he asked, leaning in.
"Now," I said, "we continue to live our lives. We save our money. We stay quiet."
Your father is currently holding a grenade with the pin pulled out, convinced it's a trophy. We just need to make sure we're far enough away when his hand gets tired.
"And Brittany? And Grandma Lorraine?"
"Lorraine will do what she always does. She'll protect the Immerser name until the final foreclosure notice is nailed to the front door. And Brittany? Well, she's discovering that being a partner means more than just wearing an apron and picking out wallpaper. She's learning that the new chapter is actually an epilogue." Tyler laughed, a genuine hearty sound that filled the small apartment. He squeezed my hand back.
"I'm sorry, Mom, for thinking you were, you know. It's okay, Ty. I needed you to think that. I needed him to think that."
If you had looked at him with anything other than disappointment, he might have wondered why we were so calm.
"Your anger was my best shield." He shook his head, amazed. "You're terrifying, you know that? I'm a mother, Tyler.
And I've been the bookkeeper for the Mercer family for a long time. I know exactly what every win cost us. Tonight, we're having pasta. But one day soon, we're going to have a real celebration. In a house that we own, with money that doesn't belong to a bank." I stood up and went back to the stove, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely. The shoebox in Ballard didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a bunker. We were safe, we were solvent, and for the first time in 15 years, we were free of the Mercer lie. As I drained the pasta, I thought of Vincent in his dark, silent kitchen in Medina, staring at a pile of past-due notices while Brittany cried in the next room.
He had the marble counters. He had the lake view. He had the legacy. But I had the light.
And I had the only Mercer who actually mattered. The final signing was not held in the grand, sweeping heights of a skyscraper. Instead, it took place in a sterile mahogany-walled satellite office near the courthouse, a place where legal loose ends were tied into knots and lives were officially severed. The room felt small, the air conditioned to a crisp, artificial chill that bit at my skin. Vincent arrived late, but the grand entrance he usually favored was missing its luster. His charcoal suit, once the armor of a conqueror, hung slightly slack on his frame, as if he had shrunken beneath the weight of his own shadow. The $15,000 Patek Philippe was still absent, replaced by the plastic digital watch that Tyler had described, a jarring, cheap ticking that felt like a countdown in the silent room. Yet, despite the hollowing of his cheeks and the bloodshot tint to his eyes, his arrogance remained a reflexive habit. He sat across from me, flanked by Harold, who was frantically leafing through a stack of papers with none of his usual crocodile confidence. Vincent didn't look at the documents. He looked at me, a thin, pitying smirk playing on his lips. "Well, Alexis," he said, his voice raspy. "This is it. The end of the line. I hope that little flat in Ballard has good heating. Seattle winters can be brutal for someone unaccustomed to such modest surroundings." I didn't answer. I didn't flinch. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the table. Beside me, Nina Castellano was a silent statue of obsidian and steel. She didn't engage with Harold's nervous small talk or Vincent's jab. She simply waited for the mediator to place the final deed to the Medina estate on the table. With a flourish that was more desperation than triumph, Vincent grabbed the pen. He signed the final transfer of title, officially claiming the Medina house, the lake property, and the Mercer firm as his sole, unencumbered possessions. He slammed the pen down, the sound echoing like a gavel. "It's mine," he murmured, more to himself than to us. "All of it." He looked at me, expecting a breakdown. He wanted to see me weep for the loss of the marble counters and the floor-to-ceiling glass. He wanted the satisfaction of knowing he had stripped me bare. "Good luck, Alexis," he sneered, leaning back. "You'll need it." I leaned forward then, not to speak, but to nod at Nina. Nina didn't say a word. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper. It wasn't a divorce document. It was a formal, updated debt disclosure and notice of acceleration from the primary lender of the Medina mortgage, a document that had been time-stamped at 9 a.m. that morning. She slid it across the table toward Harold. Harold frowned, adjusting his glasses. As he read the header, his face went from pale to a sickly, translucent white. He leaned in, his shoulder brushing Vincent's, and whispered 5 words into his ear, words that traveled through the silent room like a physical shockwave. "The bank is foreclosing tomorrow." The effect was instantaneous. It was as if someone had pulled a plug at the base of Vincent's spine. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a vacuum of pure, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his face until he was exactly the shade of the sophisticated gray walls Brittany had insisted on painting in my kitchen. "What?" Vincent gasped, his voice a strangled wheeze. "No. I have the extension. I paid the bridge loan interest." "The bridge loan defaulted 4 days ago, Vincent," Nina said, her voice cool and clinical. "And because you insisted on sole title transfer today, the due on sale clause triggered an immediate acceleration of the entire $1.1 million balance. Since you have no liquid capital and your business lines are maxed, the bank has exercised its right to seize the collateral. The locks will be changed at noon tomorrow." Vincent's hands began to shake, not the practiced tremble I had used to deceive him, but a violent, rhythmic quaking. The cheap plastic pen he had been holding fell from his fingers and clattered onto the mahogany table, rolling aimlessly until it fell into his lap. He looked at me then. Truly looked at me. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't looking at a wife, a bookkeeper, or a stagnant asset. He was looking at the woman who had stood in the center of the storm and directed the lightning. He saw the trust. He saw the $520,000 he couldn't touch. He saw that while he was fighting for the crown, I had already moved the kingdom. "You knew," he whispered, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. "You let me take it. You let me sign for all of it. You insisted, Vincent," I said softly. It was the first time I had spoken since entering the room. My voice was steady, devoid of malice, carrying only the weight of absolute finality. "You wanted the Mercer legacy. You wanted the new chapter.
I simply gave you exactly what you asked for." Harold was already packing his briefcase, his eyes darting toward the door as if he could outrun the impending lawsuits. He knew. He knew that as Vincent's lead counsel, his own reputation was about to be buried under the rubble of the Mercer Empire. Vincent tried to stand, but his legs seemed to fail him. He slumped back into the leather chair, the king of a mountain of debt, the owner of a burning house. The golden girl Brittany was likely at home right now, looking at nursery samples, unaware that by tomorrow evening, she would be packing her yoga pants into the same black garbage bags Lorraine had used on me. I stood up. I didn't scream at him. I didn't gloat about the Ballard apartment or the $50,000 in my pocket. I didn't tell him that Tyler and I were going to get pizza on the way home to celebrate our first night of true peace. I simply picked up my leather bag and adjusted the strap. Nina stood with me, a silent guardian who had helped me navigate the minefield. "We're finished here," Nina said to the mediator. I walked toward the door, pausing only for a second to look back at the man I had spent 15 years trying to please. He looked small. He looked like a stranger. The man who had valued a Patek Philippe over his son's future was now a man who owned nothing but a pile of legal liabilities. I stepped out of the office and into the hallway, where Tyler was waiting for me. He was leaning against the wall, his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning my face for the outcome. "Mom?" he asked. I didn't need to explain the bank codes or the liability clauses. I just reached out and took his hand. My grip was strong. My heart was quiet. "It's over, Ty," I said. "Let's go home." We walked out of the building and into the clean, crisp Seattle air. The rain had stopped, and for the first time in a long time, the sun was beginning to break through the gray clouds over the sound. The light was bright, almost blinding, reflecting off the puddles on the sidewalk. I had lost a house in Medina. I had lost a marriage that was a beautiful, gilded lie. But as I walked down the street with my son, the wind pulling at my hair and the salt of the ocean in my lungs, I knew I hadn't lost anything that mattered. I had saved my life. And for the first time, the future didn't look like a script I had to follow. It looked like a blank page, waiting for me to write the first word.